G'day legends, I hope that you're all well and having a good day. There's been a third strike on the Russian territory in Russia's Kursk region to an oil storage tank on an Air Force base that sits about 90 kilometres, 60 miles north of the Ukrainian border. There's been no confirmation that these strikes or the ones previously were carried out by Ukraine, although it's being reported that they were almost certainly collaborated by Ukraine. These come a day after Russia said that it had been hit hundreds of kilometres within their territory by Ukraine, said to be by Soviet-era drones, at the Enquiries Air Force Base that is home to Russia's strategic bomber fleet of aircraft, and the Russian Air Base, which both sit only a few hundred kilometres or a few hour drive from the capital Moscow. Shortly after these initial two attacks, the Kremlin launched a massive wave of new missile attacks against Ukraine. But I think this shows that the Kremlin would have to be worried somewhat about the security risk of Ukraine now demonstrating it has the potential to target hundreds of kilometres into Russian territory. And there are groups saying that today President Putin has called a meeting about Russia's home state security. The Enquiries Air Force Base is approximately 630 kilometres from the closest Ukrainian point, which is 391 miles. The Russian Air Force Base, 520 kilometres, 323 miles. And Moscow sits 460 kilometres or 285 miles. So Moscow sits well inside this shown range. The question could be asked, but what about the air defences around Moscow? And that is a very fair question. Of course, there will be a massive air defence, multi-layered air defence before that. That said, you would think that the strategic Air Force base, Enquiries 2, that is home to Russia's nuclear-capable strategic bombers, would be as heavily covered by multi-layered air defence as anywhere else in the country, as these are a massive asset to the Russian Air Force. Russia is claiming that it shot down these drones with its air defences, and it was fragmentation of the Ukrainian drones that caused the damage and the effects to the airfield, and the photographs released seem to uphold this. Even if this alleged Ukrainian strike did have a limited blast effect and limited damage, you have to take into account that, well, even if fragments of this rocket landed on the airfield after being engaged by Russian air defense, that drone, that weapon, whatever it was, but allegedly a drone, had still travelled hundreds of kilometres across Russian territory before it was engaged. And if it was engaged successfully and fragments of that were still able to land on the airfield it was targeting, you would believe that it was engaged very close to the airfield. There's no way it was engaged 100 kilometres out by an anti-air system and parts still fall on where it was aiming. So seemingly it was engaged still very close to these airfields and had probably passed by other layers of air defence on the way. The other huge effects of this could be the psychological effect and the potential for assets to be removed and redistributed to counter this. The psychological effect on Russian civilians could be potentially huge from these strikes. The average Russian citizen has not had the exposure to this war that the average Ukrainian citizen has. Strikes deep within Russian territory could come as a massive shock, as the realities of being at war probably aren't as close felt at home in everyday Russians' lives as everyday Ukrainians. And this could potentially swing people's views greatly, either in Ukraine's favour or against Ukraine. You have to remember that media narratives and reporting varies greatly, country to country, station to station, and especially east to west. How these strikes are reported, somewhere may be reported as a great thing, and somewhere may be terrible, and that can, of course, influence people's opinion. But this could potentially affect Russia's defence assets and needing to move them and reallocate them around the country. I spoke yesterday about how attacks and even just potential for attack can take assets away from the front line. Historian Richard Overy says about the World War II and US strategic air attacks in Germany, quote, "The overall bombing campaign, for all its many faults, did have the effect of imposing a huge burden on the Nazis' ability to wage war. Among other things, they were obliged to divert 2 million people, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 20% all ammunition to the air defence effort. Were it not for the Allied air offensive, the Nazi frontline troops may have had as much as 50% more weaponry and supplies. So you would think that if Ukraine has shown the ability to strike deep within Russia, potentially hundreds of kilometers within Russia, that it may need to divert some air defense and personnel away from some maybe key areas. As Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for these attacks, there has been many rumours about it was a United Kingdom drone, a US drone, and US State Department spokesman Ned Price has said today, "We are not enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders, and we are not encouraging Ukraine to strike beyond its borders." Price said the United States has not provided Ukraine with weapons that are to be used within Russia. The first time we saw the potential of Ukraine having strikes against Russia was when the US delivered the HIMARS rocket system to Ukraine. And President Biden has said the US would not send rocket systems that can strike into Russia. Of course, any system, any weapon system can shoot into the neighbouring country if close enough to the border. But the US was sending what they consider medium-range missiles, which generally shoot 45 miles or 70 kilometres. Ukrainian officials assured US officials that they will not fire these rockets into Russian territory, according to the senior administration. President Biden, in his Times essay, said, "We are not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia." This was said 6 months ago, and this was really in relation to a different type of rocket to go in the HIMARS called an ATACMS, which has a lot longer range. Ukraine has been asking for these rockets, and to my knowledge and to the public's knowledge, these missiles have not yet been delivered to the HIMARS, and only in the past 2 or 3 days, reporting has come out that the US potentially has modified the HIMARS rocket systems it delivered to Ukraine to prevent those NATOCAMs actually being used in them. There are other countries in Europe that use HIMARS with NATOCAM rockets, although the way the military-industrial complex works, they can't deliver them to Ukraine without US's permission. So was it one of those rockets? Most likely not. People also bring up about US or NATO intelligence, examples of past attacks. General Mark A. Wiley, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, has told the Senate there is a significant amount of intelligence flowing to Ukraine from the United States. We have opened up the pipes. One of the main examples people point of was when the Russian Moskva Navy ship was sunk that was allegedly targeted and given the coordinates from a US P-8 Poseidon aircraft, although hard evidence of this does not actually exist, except for a ship on the bottom of the ocean and people saying that Ukraine did not have a targeting ability to spot that ship. Something I found interesting in my research for this, and I will have a video going over this, hopefully with a legal officer talking about the laws of armed conflict, is the idea of applied neutrality that America is going under. Is applied neutrality enough for the US to remain not involved as a belligerent state, meaning involved in the war? Natalie Wiseman, a senior legal officer with the United Nations Office of Coordinated Humanitarian Affairs, defines neutrality as international law of neutrality regulates relations between states that are participating in an international armed conflict, belligerent states, and those that are not neutral states. A neutral state must defend its rights, for instance, by preventing belligerents from committing violations of its territorial integrity, remain impartial towards belligerents, and refrain from participating in this conflict. A neutral state violates neutrality by breaching its obligation to remain impartial and not to participate in conflict. For instance, a state would violate neutrality by supplying warships, arms, ammunition, military provisions, and other war materials, either directly or indirectly to a belligerent, by engaging in its own military forces, or by supplying military advisors to a party of the armed conflict, allowing belligerent use of neutral territory as a military base, the storage of war material, or passage of belligerent troops or munitions in neutral territory, furnishing troops to a belligerent, or providing or transmitting military intelligence on behalf of a belligerent, that are also examples of violations of neutrality. Former Deputy Judge Advocate General to the United States Air Force, Charles J. Dunlop Jr., when asked, can other countries supply weapons or war supplies to Ukraine without being co-belligerent in war? He continues to say, President Biden committed to providing over $1 billion in security assistance to Ukraine. But this does not, in my view, make the US a co-belligerent with Ukraine in its war with Russia. There are, however, scholars that may differ. Nevertheless, the US and other countries may be providing substantial military supplies to Ukraine. I don't think the fact alone would be sufficient to characterise the US and NATO as co-belligerents with Ukraine war in Russia. Determining the precise legal status of the US and that of other countries supplying weaponry is tricky. The best option would be to consider the US as being technically and neutral in the context of international law, notwithstanding its aggressive support of Ukraine as a matter of international politics. The law of neutrality is very complex. So thank you very much. Have a great day. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you very much. Have a nice day. And if there's anything you'd like to see me talk about, let me know. So look after yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.